There are certain things that define a country, specific experiences that everyone shares. You can't be a proper American until you've visited the Grand Canyon, for example, or firmly believe that Europe is one single country. And you're not a proper Frenchman until you've been in a strike or lost a war. So what are the things that make a real Swede? What are the things that are typically Swedish? I tried to think of 100 things that you must have experienced to be a real Swede. How many of these have you done? How Swedish are you on a scale between 1 and 100? I'll reveal my own score at the end. The passive-aggressive angry note is a very typical Swedish thing because people are afraid to confront each other. You're not a proper Swede unless you've gotten an anonymous note from a pissed-off neighbor for example, playing music too loud. Walpurgisnight, or Valborg in Swedish, is a holiday at the end of April, and it's a Swedish tradition to light bonfires and get drunk on that day. Especially in the student town of Uppsala, where you can also look at very ridiculous boat races while being inebriated. And speaking of being inebriated, Midsummer is of course also a Swedish tradition. But you're not a real Swede unless you've celebrated Midsummer in the middle of a cold rain. Bonus points if it's snowing. Have you ever spent time with a group of people where everyone has been completely silent for 5 minutes? That may sound weird in some cultures, but that's standard Swedish behavior. Swedes always watch a Donald Duck show on TV on Christmas Eve for very silly reasons. And it's pretty much mandatory for a Swede to say, "Oh, I wish I had that checkerboard paint" during a specific part of the show. Everyone does it. You're not a proper Swede unless you've refrained from taking the last piece of a cake, and instead you divided the last piece in two. That's the Swedish Piece, and it can get extremely ridiculous if more people start doing it and you get into microscopic sizes. Have you ever had your lunchbox stolen at work? Well, you're not a proper Swede unless you didn't dare to confront the thief even if you knew who it was. Ever said "you too" when a waiter said "enjoy your meal"? Or "no thanks" when a cashier tells you to have a nice weekend because you thought she was asking if you wanted the receipts? If you're still thinking about that 20 years later, then you might be a Swede. Lördagsgodis is the Swedish rule about only eating candy on a Saturday, and every Swede has followed it. You must have seen Fäbodjäntan with the Falu sausage scene. Don't ask. If you don't know what it is, don't Google it, but if you know, you know. You are not a proper Swede unless you've dunked a cheese sandwich in O'boy chocolate milk. I'm a bit weird though, since I don't actually like cheese sandwiches, so I've never done that myself. It's a Swedish tradition to tell Norway jokes about how stupid the Norwegians are. You really must have done that as a Swede. But fun fact, the Norwegians actually tell Swedish jokes about how stupid the Swedes are, so yeah, sibling love, you know. And speaking of that, you must also have said the word dansk jävlar at some point, Danish devils. Sweden and Denmark are the two countries in the world that have fought the most amount of wars ever, after all, so that rivalry has bitter roots, even if we're good friends today. You must have fantasized about setting fire to the Gävle goat at some point if you're a Swede. It's something everyone does. Everyone has planned it at some point. Swedes love to stand in line, but we also hate it when people cut in line. But we also hate confrontation, so you must have seen someone cut in line and stood there fuming, but you didn't do anything about it. Have you ever had to be a silly gingerbread man or a star boy in a Lucia procession on December 13? Congratulations! Then you just might be a proper Swede. And have you ever drank warm Åbro or Arboga beer and actually enjoyed it? Then you might also be a Swede. Have you ever invaded Poland? Or wait, that's a German thing these days. We Swedes stopped doing that after the 1600s, so skip that point. Swedes love to take forest walks and to pick Swedish blueberries or chanterelles. You really must have done that if you're a real Swede. And obviously, you must have had a Swedish fika. That's a given, right? Taco Tuesday is something that other countries do. In Sweden, we go for Taco Friday instead. Proper Swedish tacos, possibly with pineapple and banana. In Sweden, most rental apartments have a communal laundry room that you can book, but most people steal each other's times. If you haven't written an angry notice that some bastard stole your time, then you're not a proper Swede. Systembolaget is the state-owned liquor store, and if you wanna buy booze, you have to buy it there, and it's closed on holidays. Every single Swede has forgotten to buy booze ahead of a holiday and cursed Systembolaget and Sweden thoroughly. Swedes live in perpetual darkness between November and February. So you're not a proper Swede unless you've sighed in relief and turned your face towards the sun in the beginning of spring. Ever waited to exit your apartment because you spotted a neighbor through your peephole? Then you might be Swedish. We don't really want to risk having to talk to anyone. And speaking of neighbors, you're not a real Swede unless you've lived in the same apartment for several years and you haven't had a real conversation with a single neighbor. And even if you don't eat a lot of cheese, like me, then you have used an osthyvel. I'm not sure why I'm holding up my hand, I don't have one here, but yeah, either way, a cheese slicer. You have used it if you're a Swede. Everyone has. And something else that every Swede has done is complain when someone is using the cheese slicer incorrectly. If you don't cut the cheese evenly, we call it making a ski slope. You must have swam naked in a lake or in the sea if you're a Swede. We're not as prude about nudity as some other cultures. And you must also have slept in a tent in the forest. Allemansrätten is Sweden's right to roam in nature, and we definitely make use of it. You don't really have to like it, but you must have camped in the woods. It's mandatory. Now let's get back to the booze. A real Swede must have visited Majorca or the Canary Islands to get properly sloshed. It's almost a national sport getting drunk in Spain. We compete against the Germans and the British for the world record. Back in the olden days of the 1990s, something called Bingolotto was invented. It's a combination of bingo and lottery, and it's televised so all the elderly Swedes can enjoy it. And unfortunately, they also force young Swedes to partake in it, so every Swede has played Bingolotto, mostly against our will. Do you know what a smorgasbord is? Well, of course you do, but it's a Swedish invention, so it's called smörgåsbord. A special version of that is the Christmas table, a Christmas smorgasbord, and you're not a proper Swede unless you've tried it. But even more Swedish is the sandwich cake, smörgåstårta. Again, this is something that I don't really like, but I have tried it. Every single Swede has. A Swedish classic is when you participate in 4 specific grueling races in a single year. It involves long-distance running, swimming, skiing, and biking. Not every Swede has done a Swedish classic, but every single Swede has promised that they will do it someday. Someday. Do you know who Errol Norstedt is? No? How about Eddie Meduza is nom de plume, or maybe I should say nom de guitar? You're not a proper Swede unless you've sung at least one Eddie Meduza song. I could give it a pass for Fröken Snusk for the younger generation. Swedes love to recycle, and every Swede has packed the car full of things for the recycling center. And dutifully organized every single thing so that it's recycled properly. You must have seen the king or the queen or the crown princess. It's your duty as a Swede. And you must also have watched På spåret, an amazing quiz show. And if you're a Swede, you have also been to a music festival. Bonus points if you stole your parents' whiskey and brought it with you, so you drank something that was older than yourself. You must have taken a boat ride in the archipelago, either the Stockholm archipelago or the Gothenburg archipelago. It's a must for every Swede. And you must also have complained that Sweden has become so bad lately. It's extremely Swedish to complain about today's society and yearn for the good old days. Det var bättre förr, as we say in Swedish. Sarek was a band that had a hit song called Genom eld och vatten. If you haven't sang along to that song at a nightclub, well, then you're not really a Swede. And likewise, you must have eaten kebab pizza. It's the ambrosia of the gods and, ironically enough, a very Swedish dish. A very common sight at Swedish workplaces is a "your mom does not work here" sign. It's mandatory for Swedes to have seen a sign like that at least once. Sweden doesn't have extremely high mountains, but we still go skiing quite often. So you must have been to Sälen or Åre or some other ski resort, and of course you must have been to an afterski. I mentioned that Swedes love to stand in line, but we also love the queuing system where you take a number and wait for your turn. To be a proper Swede, you must have used this numbering system, and you must have thought that it was a really good system that other countries should adopt. When you're driving a car in Sweden, you stop for pedestrians who are crossing the road. This should be the case in every country, but apparently some drivers abroad drive like maniacs. But yeah, waiting for pedestrians, that's very Swedish. I guess we have to talk about ABBA as well. Not every Swede likes ABBA, but everyone can sing their songs. So if you're a real Swede, you have sung an ABBA song at karaoke at least once. In Sweden, you can look up anyone's tax record. It's public information. And there's a site called Ratsit where you can look up anyone's info for a small fee. Unfortunately, you're not a proper Swede unless you've looked up at least one person's tax information using a site like that. If you've said something very inappropriate to your boss at a work party and you didn't get any negative consequences for that, then you might be Swedish. I wouldn't try that in places like the UK or the US though. Ever joined a union? Well, if you're Swedish, you have been part of one. And if you're a Swede, you will also have eaten French fries with béarnaise sauce. It's not really a Swedish specialty, but they have it at every bar, and every Swede has at some point eaten a crappy French fry dinner like that. And you must also have sung the Swedish song Sommaren är kort. It's Swedish for the summer is short, so you must have sung it at summer at some point, probably while drunk. It's mandatory. Oh, and have you ever been stuck behind an A-tractor? That's also a very Swedish thing. These modified cars are a menace to society, slow-moving bastards. You must have been on a Finland cruise at some point. Every Swede has been on these white trash cruises of the Baltic Sea. And at some point in your life, you must have been surprised that people abroad celebrate Christmas on December 25th instead of December 24th. And speaking of Christmas, you must have drank julmust. It's a Swedish tradition, and during Christmas time, it's the only drink that's more popular than Coke. Something quite vile that comes from Sweden is the so-called caviar on tube. Every single Swede, myself included, unfortunately, have tried Kalles caviar at some point. And every single Swede has also celebrated the cinnamon bun day. That's quite a bit more tasty than the caviar and well worth celebrating. August in Sweden is full of crayfish parties, and that's something that every Swede has attended, even if you don't eat crayfish. Ever thought that the weather is too hot in summer and too cold in winter? Congratulations! That's a very Swedish thing. Maternity leave is a common thing in many countries, but in Sweden there's also paternity leave. Do you find that completely normal? Well, then you just might be Swedish. You must have eaten princess cake at some point, and it counts even if you don't eat the green marzipan. And you must also have eaten a semla, but only in February, otherwise it doesn't count. And every single Swede has reflected on the fact that herring is served at every major Swedish holiday. Have you ever stood on public transport rather than sit next to someone? Well, if you're a Swede, then you have. A Scandinavian mile is 10 kilometers, and it's extremely widely used in Sweden. Everyone knows that it's 10 miles to the next town, for example, or that Sweden is 160 miles long. And every Swede is surprised at some point in their life that people abroad don't know what a 10-kilometer mile is. If you're a proper Swede, then you will have inspected a relatively unknown person's apartment or house. Husesyn is very common in Sweden, and the first time you visit someone, you scrutinize the whole house in detail. Sweden is a very informal society as opposed to many other cultures. If you're Swedish, then you're used to addressing teachers or doctors or other authority figures on a first-name basis. Swedes don't buy rounds, so if you're a Swede, you will have been at a bar and everyone in the group buys their own beer. Jantelagen, the law of Jante, is a Scandinavian philosophy that you shouldn't believe that you're anything special. So if you're a Swede, you have complained about people who brag, possibly while bragging about being so humble yourself. Ever drank milk as an adult? That's definitely a Swedish thing. And have you ever studied something at university just because it's free and you're curious about the topic? That's also very common in Sweden. You must have complained loudly that marijuana or some other drug is extremely harmful while you think it's perfectly reasonable to get drunk every weekend. And have you ever pet a reindeer, or at least seen one in real life? That's something that every Swede has done. Well, almost every Swede at least. Oh, and you must have seen a moose. That's pretty inevitable in Sweden. And speaking of animals, you must also have seen a hedgehog. Those cute little critters. Have you ever overshared when going to the toilet? Swedes apparently love telling exactly what they're gonna do when they go to the bathroom. Like, I'm gonna take a piss, or I'm gonna take a dump, or so on. Personally, I love saying that I'm gonna drain the weasel instead. And I know that other cultures than Sweden does the next one, but Swedes love having ketchup in their pasta. I think even more so than Americans, and that's saying quite a bit. Ever sighed at Vikings being portrayed with horned helmets? Well, every Swede has. And if you're a Swede, you must have quoted The Seventh Seal with Ingmar Bergman, you know, the chess scene with death. But most likely you haven't seen the full movie. You must also have complained about immigrants if you're a real Swede. Bonus points if you're actually an immigrant yourself and you're still complaining about other immigrants. That's ironically enough quite Swedish. Swedes pay a lot of taxes, and at some point you must have wondered, hey, where's all that tax money really spent? And have you ever seen a Dalecarlian horse, a dalahäst, being made? That's something every Swede has. And every Swede has seen video clips of Americans trying surströmming. It's a time-honored national pastime. Surströmming is of course the extremely stinky Swedish fermented herring. All Swedes have tried snus at some point. It's unavoidable, really. And you must have gotten stuck behind the stroller mafia at some point. You know, these Kevins or Karens who block up the entire road with their enormous strollers. Chances are that you've been woken up in the middle of the night by a phone call. The caller often asks something moronic like, "Oh, were you sleeping?" As a Swede, you will have answered with an awkward, no, not at all, to be polite, even if it was at 3 a.m. Something that's popped up in Sweden this last decade is that payment terminals have choices of tipping amounts. I think it's American companies who make these tipping terminals who want to make tipping a thing in Sweden. But every Swede has complained about these tipping choices at some point. Ever driven or ridden a Volvo? Awesome, that's very Swedish of you. Bonus points if it was a Saab. And ever bought any IKEA furniture? Well, every Swede has. And come to think of it, so has the rest of the world. Astrid Lindgren is a beloved author of books like Pippi Longstockings, and you're not a proper Swede unless you've read her books. And you must also have seen Allsång på Skansen, a sing-along music show that's been running for ages and ages. Summer in Sweden is unpredictable, so you're not a real Swede unless you've taken vacation in July and it's been bad weather every single day of your vacation. Everyone watches the Eurovision Song Contest at some point, but if you're a Swede, you have also watched Melodifestivalen. It's the show where people decide which song to send to Eurovision. And speaking of Eurovision and Melodifestivalen, you must have sang Stadig ljus while being drunk at some point. It's inevitable. Have you ever been confused that Lucia isn't originally from Sweden? Sweden celebrates the Saint Lucia on December 13, and it's a very Swedish thing, even if she was an Italian saint. You're not a real Swede unless you've learned something about being kind from the comic book Bamse. And finally, number 100. If you're a Swede, at some point you have been just a little bit smug about being Swedish. We all think that we live in the best country in the world, and we try to be humble about it. But deep down, at some point, every single Swede has been a smug and arrogant bastard about being a Swede. And that was 100 things that you must have done to be a proper Swede. How many of these did you tick off? My score is 89, which means that I'm pretty Swedish, but not actually 100% Swedish. But then again, I'm not sure that I know all that many Swedes who actually are. Either way, I hope you enjoyed this list. Like and subscribe, but most importantly, have a great day.